Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
That was pretty good, but you know, I'm from the civil rights community, and there's this long history and tradition of call and response. So can we try that again? Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Much better, thank you. I'm here to talk to you about planning for an emergency with people not like me, and by not like me, I mean not like you, not like me. Okay? Because you're planning for people like me, not like you. Okay. Very good. Let's get into it. Disaster planning and disability. I want to tell you a little bit about the background of this, why it's important, why we're going to talk about it before we get too deep into it. This is interesting. I think there was a poll done in 2001 that talks about and investigated who is using services and what's going on. 58% of people with disabilities don't know whom to contact about emergency plans in their community. And there's an asterisk on all of these. The asterisk is that these percentages are higher for people with disabilities across the board than they are for able-bodied people, people without disabilities. So 58% of people with disabilities don't know who their contact should be for an emergency. 61% of people with disabilities have not made plans to quickly and safely evacuate their homes. And among those with disabilities fully employed, full or part-time, 50% say no plans have been made to safely evacuate their workplace. Again, all three of these statistics are higher for people with disabilities than they are for the rest of the population. So not only is this a challenge for you in the room, it's also a challenge for the people with disabilities who don't have the information. So part of your job, I think, has to be to communicate this. So take that back with you, please. There are some success stories about disaster planning. After the '93 World Trade Center bombing, the local emergency management office and the Associated Blind workers, Associated Blind worked with the fire department to develop a comprehensive evacuation plan and a drill for their staff, most who have either low or no vision. And I will slow down. I apologize to both of you over there. So on September 11th, the entire staff calmly and safely evacuated their building's 9th floor, a success that they attributed directly to the customized planning that they had undertaken. So this stuff is important. People survived 9/11 because of evacuation and emergency preparedness planning. A wheelchair user who was employed on the 68th floor of the World Trade Center made it out okay. 2 World Trade Center employees with prosthetic legs were able to get out okay. They walked down the stairs because of the high-tech stuff that they were wearing that day. And let me tell you that we, at the EEOC, we had an office at 7 World Trade Center, which was also affected in part of the problem. Not one of the towers, but right there in the complex. And we had a number of people in our office who were working there who had disabilities of various types. We had sight-impaired people, we had people with hearing impairments, and we had people with mobility impairments. And every single one of those people got out and was fine, largely because we as an agency had undertaken to plan for the evacuation in an emergency or a disaster situation. And so this stuff is really, it's important. So let's take a look at it. We'll take a look at it in a second. There we go. Did I do that or did, I don't know.
I'm not sure.
Okay. So let's talk about designing a disaster plan. The purpose of a disaster plan is fairly straightforward. You want to know what's going to happen in a disaster, but you want to facilitate and organize employer and employee action during workplace emergencies. That sounds pretty straightforward, right? But what does it really mean? What's part of this? So let me give you a clue about some of the elements here. Procedures for reporting in emergencies, evacuation procedures and emergency escape route assignments, contact information, procedures for employees who remain after the alarm to perform critical duties, and then of course procedures to account for all employees after evacuation has been completed. All of these need to be part of your plan. And the plan really needs to have a second plan in it, which is what's going to happen with the evacuation. That's the second check mark up there, the evacuation procedures and emergency escape route assignments. And that's where I'm going to focus my attention. The rest of these are important, but I think that they're better left to experts on disaster planning than they are to somebody who's more an expert on how to help people with disabilities. So let me focus in on the evacuation part of this. But let me start with this bottom bullet, which is include people with disabilities at all points in this process. Your bigger overarching plan should have input from people with disabilities. And it should be as many different kinds of disabilities as you can identify in the place where you're making the plan. So if you've got a wide range of people who have disabilities, you need to be engaging with them and making sure that you understand what their needs are and what their concerns are and how you can address them. Another thing that I want to point out is that oftentimes we as a society make assumptions about what people with disabilities can and cannot do. For example, you might make an assumption about what I might do in an emergency if I was on, say, the 10th floor and I wanted to get out fast, right? And you might assume that I'm going to need a lot of assistance to get out. And the real answer is I'm going to want you to get out of my way because I will get down those flights of stairs faster than you will. I can really go downstairs fast if I'm not in this wheelchair. And I have no qualms about getting out of it and getting going. So if I were part of the community that you were planning for, you wouldn't know that unless you had a conversation with me. You would want to have that conversation with me to make sure that you understood what was going on, and you wouldn't be looking for me at the landing on the 10th floor because I would already be outside waiting for you. So that's an important part of it. And as you'll see, one of the things you're going to want to do is you're going to want to make sure that you keep track of everyone, not just the people with disabilities, but everybody. You know, ideally, these plans work best when you're in an environment where you know who's coming and going and when, and so you know who exactly is in the building. Now, not all buildings are set up that way. Certainly this building's not set up that way. Certainly many of the buildings that you all are going to be talking about and living in won't have that sort of capability. But if that capability is there, you should find a way to utilize it. Find a way to bring into your disaster planning and your accounting for people the information that you know because you have an in and out card system, for example. So we'll get into that in a little bit. Let's look at the evacuation plan itself. The purpose of the evacuation plan is to get everyone out of the facility in an emergency. Not most people, but everyone. And again, I want to stress that we get everyone out if we know who everyone is. If we don't know who's in the facility, it's hard to get everyone out of the facility. So to the extent that you can, try to make sure that you have a head count or that you've made a physical search of the facility in a systematic way when you're evacuating. Elements of an evacuation plan: conditions for evacuation or for shelter in place, a clear chain of command, specific evacuation procedures including routes and exits, a system for accounting for people after evacuation. I've already kind of talked to you about that a little bit. Designation of employees that will perform critical duties during an evacuation. So you want to know who's got responsibility for what. And finally, procedures for assisting people with disabilities. And that's where we're going to focus this morning for the rest of this talk. How are we going to take care of those people? And again, I want to stress the best way to do this is to involve the people with disabilities up front in your planning process. Make sure you're talking to them, asking them, what are your concerns? What are your capabilities? What are your limitations? This is not a question, let me make this abundantly clear. This is not a question of what is your impairment? What is your diagnosis? What is your prognosis? These are not the appropriate questions. The appropriate questions are, what are your limitations? What kind of assistance will you need? What are your capabilities? What can we do to help you? Those are the kinds of questions, okay? So to design this plan, you're going to want to designate and train emergency coordinators and alternates perhaps, and an evacuation supervisor and maybe alternates for them, and all of this is going to depend upon how big your facility is. You know, if you're talking about a facility like the World Trade Center, you're talking about probably coordinators for every floor and supervisors for every 20 or so people. In a smaller facility, you know, this scales down. But you really want to have a chain of command where people have well-defined responsibilities and everybody knows who's doing what. It's an important piece of this, because one person, unless it's a pretty small facility, is usually not going to be able to get it all done. But you're talking about stuff that's going to happen in a panic sort of situation, perhaps. Things have to happen quickly. Things are going to move fast. You're probably going to have difficulty communicating and seeing. And so it's important to break it into sizable, properly sized chunks so that people aren't overwhelmed. Use a buddy system for people with disabilities or people with special needs. There might be people that don't qualify under the law as people with disabilities, but they might need something special. You might have somebody who you just know, I mean, there's nothing physically wrong with them other than they're, I don't know, maybe they're older. And you know that they can't walk down 15 flights of stairs without having some problems and needing some assistance. Now, they're not disabled under the law. The Americans with Disabilities Act wouldn't necessarily call that person disabled, but they still might need assistance. And so this is a person who you ought to include as having some special needs and needing some assistance. If you buddy up these people, if you assign somebody who doesn't need help the specific task and responsibility of making sure that this person gets the help they need, not necessarily providing it themselves, but that they get the help they need, that's a really good plan. Focus on that. Use the buddy system. It's been very effective. Post floor plans with evacuation routes in the work areas. You know, this is really important. The beauty of this became abundantly clear to me 2.5 years ago when the EEOC in Houston moved out of the federal building temporarily and into commercial space because they're revamping and rehabbing the Mickey Leland building. And we moved into a new office, and obviously none of us had been there before, and it was this giant rectangle, and everything looked the same. Every office was exactly the same size, and it was just offices, offices, offices. But we posted floor plans about every 30 feet on the walls to help the movers and to help the employees that were coming into this building for the first time identify where they needed to go, where stuff was. And it was so tremendously helpful. The feedback that we got out of a survey after the move was that the most helpful thing we did was posting those floor plans, those diagrams. And I have to believe that in an evacuation situation that that's going to be the case too. And you know, hotels have been doing this for decades. You know, the door has all got the map on it, and here's where your room is, and the red line, that's your route of egress to get out in an emergency. It's a really good idea, and it's really easy to do, and probably really cheap, if not free. Establish assembly areas. These are, I think, referred to in the law as areas of rescue assistance. You know, somebody who's really good at this is the airports. I don't know if you've been to the airport lately, but both Hobby and Bush have signage that is dramatically apparent about the areas of rescue assistance. They're labeled, they're in your face almost. And you know, it's kind of comforting when you go through a facility like that and you see that. And it's something that I urge you to take a look at doing, especially if your facility is bigger. Maybe not so much in a little facility, but in a big facility with a lot of people, it's a really good idea. Establish shelter locations if you're going to keep people in the building. That's a whole different subject that I'm not going to get into because it's very complicated. There are lots of pieces of reference on that available. The internet is replete with ideas about sheltering in place, about the supplies that you need, and about what you need to do to rooms and or floors to make them appropriate for shelter in place in different types of disasters. But we're not going to go into it here, except to let you know that it's part of the plan. You should review and know which operating systems can and should be shut down during an emergency situation. Like elevators. It's important to know that because it really affects how people get out. There are other things that may get shut down depending on the type of disaster, which could range from electrical and include lighting to ventilation and all sorts of other things. It's important to understand that. Talk to your buildings operations people about that, your facilities people. Conduct training of the plan requirements. I can't stress this enough. If you don't train the plan, you may as well not have the plan. And then after you've trained the plan, it's also important to do some drills on the plan. Get people used to it. It's important to do this stuff when you do your fire drills. And it's similar to and related to your fire drills. So do it with your fire drills. You're doing those on a regular basis anyway. Why not? An increased understanding, this is for planning in the workplace, you need an increased understanding of both the person factors and the environmental factors to help you identify specific behaviors and environmental conditions that increase the margin of safety for those who are most at risk. So this breaks down to two different things. It's kind of people and facility. We'll take them in turn. The people factors are the participatory action planning, the training, and the feedback. Feedback is really important. If you're not checking in to see if these things are workable or working when you're doing the drills, then you're not doing the whole job. You've got to check back and make sure it works. The environmental factors include access compliance, assistive technology, programs, practices, and procedures. You heard a little bit about some of that stuff, I think, from Lex earlier this morning. You need to consider everyone as you're doing this. So this is obviously employees, but I want to stress that it's not just employees. I got a big list here. I'm not going to read them all. You can read, most of you. Those of you who can't, this is on the PowerPoint and you can get it there. But I think that there's a lot of people that you need to consider as you go through this process. The public is a big part of what you're going to be doing. And if your building and facility is open to the public, you have to plan not just for the employees, but for the public as well. And sometimes that makes it a lot harder to think about, all right, how am I going to interact with and get information and input from the people with disabilities that might be using this facility? And the answer is you can't. You can't do it all. But my suggestion is that you poll people when you see people, when you have an opportunity to talk to people. People with open and obvious disabilities like I have are easy targets for these kinds of discussions. And it's okay to ask the questions as long as you ask them in the right way. I talked about that earlier. It's not about what the affliction is, it's about what kind of assistance do you need, what are the limitations, okay? Areas of rescue assistance. I've got a slide on this because I think it's an important piece of it. It's a designated area with a direct access to an exit, so it's often a landing in a fire escape or a fire stairwell. Or immediately adjacent to one of those. It's for people who are unable to use the stairs. During an emergency evacuation, these people will be temporarily awaiting further instructions or assistance, right? This is governed by the ADA Accessible Guidelines for Buildings and Facilities, affectionately known as ADAG. There's a PDF available of the ADAG architectural requirements at that website. And it's worth taking a look at because it's got some technical assistance in there, it's got some Q&As and some facts, and it's got a lot of really good information about how you can plan for these sets of circumstances, as well as all of the architectural requirements that are now the law for new construction. Now, many of the facilities that you're managing may not have been built since this was the law. And so many of the things that are detailed here may not be part of your facility, but you should take a look at it anyway because some of this stuff is stuff that you can incorporate after the fact. For example, the ADAG publication includes a section on signage. And how do you let people know about these areas? What should the signage look like? What size should the font be in? What's the Braille requirement that goes with it? What kinds of lighting and emergency notification features are you looking at? Those kinds of things can all be retrofitted for fairly short money. And it's worth taking a look at. So I urge you to click through on that link that's in the handout and take a look at that. You download that PDF and maybe keep it on your desktop. It's worth looking at, and it's got a lot of interesting stuff that you may not have thought of. Employees with disabilities. This is under the person factors part of my analysis. Use an individualized approach for evacuation contingencies that fit the person. And remember, don't make assumptions about this. As my example, I hope, points out to you, don't make assumptions about what people can and cannot do. Let them tell you what they can and cannot do, especially employees. They're there, you can talk to them about this. Meet with the human resources and the building safety staff to pre-plan emergency contingencies. Have an understanding of what sorts of things might come up. The human resources people generally have a pretty good idea of who has a disability and to what extent they might need help. And of course, the facilities people know what is available and not available in the facility. So getting those two groups of people together is probably a really good idea. You want to assess the specific needs of an employee with a disability. You want to talk about the different types of emergencies that might occur and the location of the employees during the emergencies. Now that's a really important part, because if you don't know where the people are and you can't track them down in order to give them help, then all the planning is going to be in vain. Now, some of the people are going to be moving around. It's important to know that. If they've got a job that makes them move around a facility, you've got to understand where they might be and under what circumstances. And maybe there's a schedule that will help you know that. You know, because maybe on Fridays they're going to be in room 201, but every other day they're going to be on the 10th floor doing something totally different. So take a look at those sorts of things. And then finally, update and transfer the plan to wherever the employee might get transferred within, well, here it says company, within the city framework. You know, because people do move around, and you should share information. If somebody transfers in or transfers out and you have specific information, or they have specific information in their disaster and evacuation plan that relates to that employee, it should be shared. It's important to do that. Two basic approaches to training staff to assist the people with disabilities. First is the buddy system. I've talked about this a little bit already. This is one of the best practices that we see across the country and that people are really, really successful with. The other one is a cross-training system where employees help fellow employees with disabilities, and a lot of people have information. This is especially valuable where you've got work share arrangements or where people work in different places within the facility across the day. So it might not make sense to have a buddy system, a one-on-one buddy up thing, because maybe the buddy is at the other end of the facility for most of the day, or because one or the other of them moves around. So you look at these cross-training things and do different things for different people. People with visual limitations might have totally different needs, do have totally different needs than people with mobility impairments like me. So it's really an individualized assessment, much like your obligation under the Americans with Disabilities Act for providing accommodations in the workplace. It requires an individualized assessment and approach to what is going on with that particular employee. And finally, the training protocols should instruct employees to follow their pre-assigned and pre-rehearsed functions and refine their responses based on feedback from the drills. So again, this is kind of a cyclical process where you brainstorm about what you need to do, you put the plan into a written document, you rehearse the plan, you get feedback on how the plan worked in the rehearsal, in the drill, and then you do it all again, implementing the feedback. The environmental factors. This is the stuff in the building. This is the facility stuff. The National Business and Disability Council has published this book, actually I think it's a paper, the Emergency Evacuation Preparation Checklist to include people with disabilities. I'm sorry I didn't put in the citation on the web to a web page on this. It is readily available. If you Google that, you'll find it. The manual contains a checklist of environment and person factors that are assessed to help you determine the ADA access compliance level for employees with disabilities in their work environments. It's very useful, it's very detailed, and it has a lot of different ideas in it. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Job Accommodation Network, which is a website and an organization that provides ideas about accommodating people with disabilities across all kinds of disabilities. They do a wonderful job of providing answers for people's requests for accommodation. This document is to emergency preparedness what JAN is to accommodations in the workplace. So it's really helpful, really useful. And then finally, you should have safety officers who conduct an inventory of building features, such as the accessible emergency signal systems, the alarms, the pathways of travel to the exits to make sure that they're free of obstacles, and so forth. They give you a bunch of ideas about how to make your plan better, how to make it more effective, and how to make it easier to implement. So it's worth taking a look at. Assistive technology, I'm not going to go into this in much depth because I think that you heard a lot about this from Lex early this morning. But there's a lot of equipment out there that can make the evacuation easier. Take a look at what works for your situation and your budget, do what you can with it, and understand one thing about this assistive technology if you go this route. And that is that it never works as easily as their marketing materials would lead you to believe that it works. And getting a person down a set of stairs on one of these things, like the evac chair, is a lot harder than it looks. Deploying the chair, getting the person into the chair, and then taking it down the stairs all takes more time than you think it's going to take, and there are difficulties that pop up. So practice it. Make sure that there are drills with this equipment if you're using it. It's hard to move people who can't move themselves, no matter what equipment you might have. So try this out before you get to the situation where you have to use it for real. Talk to other people who have used it. I also suggest that you talk to the fire and police departments about some of this stuff, because they've got just a huge knowledge base on moving people, especially the fire department, moving people who can't help because maybe they're unconscious. Not necessarily people with disabilities, but people who can't help. They know how to do it. They can train you in how to do it. There are all sorts of specialized carries and lifts and things that they use that make this work much more effectively. So engage the fire department in your disaster planning. They're happy to help. It's part of what they do. They want you to be prepared. They want to know where the people are that they have to go get and help you go get. I'm sure that there are first responders here who would echo this, but engage them. It will help. Environmental factors for access, the area of rescue and assistance. You know, I understand that there are budget constraints that make some of this pie in the sky, but to the extent that you can do it, two-way radios, cell phones, rechargeable flashlights in the areas of rescue assistance are a really good idea. They can let these people communicate and let them see in situations where they might not otherwise see. We talked about knowing what systems are going to go down. The electricity and the lights are going to go down. There's almost certainly not going to be lights. Consider hardwired intercoms for direct communications with the fire department and other first responders. Now, some of your facilities may already have this. Some of them may not. There is federal money available for some of this stuff. So it might be that you can find some grant money from the government. And then rescue assistance areas should be clearly designated with the international symbol of accessibility. Again, I direct your attention back to the ADAG guidelines, that PDF that I had the link for up there. That's got all the requirements for the signage in it. And it's really easy. There are examples in that PDF of what these signs should look like. You can just take it right over to your graphics people or to the print shop and have them made up. It's really easy. And with the way that the computers are set up now, you can probably make them on your computer. Programs, practices, and procedures. You want to involve the employees with disabilities in all discussions. I can't stress this enough. Please, please, please talk to the people who are going to need help. They know best what kind of help they're going to need. Now, some of them won't tell you. Some of them will tell you they don't need any help when they really do. And you got to be wary of that. You got to understand that some people think they can do more than they can do. And you got to plan accordingly. But you also need to take into account that some people are going to be able to do just fine. And be prepared for that too. Another good reason to have exercises and drills. See what people can actually do versus what they tell you they can do. It's a good idea. There are common elements to evacuation programs. That's awareness and preparedness, notification, warning, and instruction, evacuation, movement, and transportation, areas of refuge and shelter. All of these are part of what you want to be looking at. Re-entry, when and if it's appropriate. You know, sometimes you go back into the building. If it's a drill, you go back in. If the building burned to the ground, you're not going back in. In between those two, there's all kinds of different situations and scenarios. You need to have some protocol for determining when it's okay to go back in, if it's not at either end of the spectrum. You want to ask all employees if they have limitations that might impact an evacuation. Now, the EEOC has issued guidance on this. A lot of people are concerned that they shouldn't be asking these questions of people. And our response to you is, you may ask under certain circumstances. This link gives you our guidance specifically related to this subject. And I'm going to go through most of what's on the guidance in the next few slides. And I'm happy to take questions about any of this afterwards. But one of the questions that's in the guidance is, can an employer ask an employee whether they'll require assistance in the event of an evacuation because of a disability or a medical condition? And I know that some of you have heard you can't ask these questions. And the answer is, you can ask these questions. Some employees may need assistance because of these impairments. And it's important that you do ask the questions. But it's also important that you understand that there are limitations on what you can do with the data that you get, the information you receive when they answer. You can't willy-nilly share it with people. Only people who have a need to know should be having this information about people's disabilities, impairments, and needs for assistance. If this information is recorded, it cannot go in the personnel file. Let me say that again. If this information is recorded, you may not, it is unlawful to place it in the personnel file. It must be kept in a separate file that's confidential and that's treated like you would treat medical records. Talk to your HR people about that. There's a very different procedure. It's a separate file, it's under lock and key, it has limited access. So if you write it down, it's got to be specially treated. If it's not written down, it's a different deal. It can be in your head. But don't share it with people who don't have a need to know. Okay? Is that clear? Okay. Second one, how can an employer identify individuals who may require assistance? So the answer to this is simple. You can ask. And there are three areas, three situations where you may ask. You may ask after you've made a job offer, but before the person starts work. And that is, do you need any sort of assistance? Or do you anticipate needing any sort of assistance during an emergency? That question can and should be asked between offer and beginning of work, because you need the information to appropriately plan for a disaster. You can periodically ask all of your employees, hey, has anything come up since the last time we asked or since you were hired that we might need to know about that would help you in an emergency? Do you need any help? You can ask. And you know, the really easy way to do this is by email. The problem with doing it by email, of course, is that there's a responsive email, and if you print that email, you got to keep it in a special place. But you'll have a record. And you'll have a record of who didn't respond as well. And that is important, because if people don't tell you information and later on there's a disaster of some kind, the building catches fire, and somebody has trouble getting out, gets hurt because they didn't get the help they needed because they didn't tell you they needed help, you'll have a record to demonstrate, hey, I didn't get a response from this person. I asked everybody, do you need help? And they never replied. So that's why you might want to do it that way, even though it causes some record keeping headaches, because you might want to keep a record of the people who failed to respond. Because later on, you know, they're going to blame you, and it won't be your fault. And then third, you know, whether an employee periodically surveys its employees or not, it can ask employees with known disabilities what sort of help they need. So if somebody has an open and obvious disability like I do, you can You can come up to me and say, hey, what kind of assistance would you need in an emergency? Anybody with an open and obvious disability, you may ask. You may. And again, keep in mind, you can't ask what the diagnosis is, you can't ask what the prognosis is, you can't ask those sorts of things, but you can ask what are your limitations, what kind of assistance do you need, and what kind of capabilities do you have. Those are all okay. Oh, did it again. There we go. And may an employer specifically ask what type of assistance is needed? And the answer to this is of course. That's the whole point of this exercise. You need to ask this. And the EEOC is going to support you. We are not going to find you liable for disability discrimination if you're asking questions for this purpose. Okay? It's really simple. Go ahead and ask. Who's allowed to have the information? Well, the ADA has provisions that require employers to keep medical information about applicants and employees confidential. Medical information. Those provisions include an exception that allows an employer to share medical information with first aid and safety personnel. So, you've designated somebody as the floor coordinator, they can have the information. They have a need to know. That's what I was talking about earlier about the need to know. You can share the information with the first responders. You can share the information with your safety officer if you have one, and if you've got a nurse on site or another person designated for first aid sorts of responsibilities, you can share it with them. So those are all okay. The whole idea is you're sharing the information in order to benefit the person, not for any other purpose. You share it for any other purpose, you're likely to be in trouble. The U.S. Access Board has made a number of recommendations about this. Let me share those with you. They suggest you take an inventory of the people with disabilities, that you know the number of the disabilities, the specific needs of the people with the disabilities, and their preferences about evacuation. If you do that, you'll have a much better likelihood of having a successful disaster recovery kind of plan implementation. And here's some other recommendations. Post-emergency information in alternate formats. So there might be Braille, there might be large print, there might be a bunch of different things. Post-alarm alert procedures that include specific meeting places. Have assigned stairways for identified personnel, so you know where people are going to be. Again, this is the making sure you get everybody out, so you know where they're going to be. Floor wardens to assist with the evacuation process. And as I've told you before, talk with the first responders about your plan. Let them have some input. That's what I've got. The EEOC is celebrating its 50th anniversary next summer. This month, in just a couple of days, is the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, which is the primary statute that we enforce. So I want to point out our brand new 50-year anniversary logo up there. And I want to take your questions to the extent that you have any. So, questions? Yep. Can you hear me?
Does anyone have a question? Come on, we got the two microphones now.
It's hard to imagine after all that information that you have no questions.
Marty, I'm thinking about implementing a survey tool to gather this kind of information. And I'm wondering if I use a web-based survey tool, what are the requirements on me as far as accessibility of that website? And can I expect that the adaptive technology is going to exist on the other end, or do I have to build it into the actual survey tool itself?
That's a great question. I think the answer is some of it has to be in the survey tool. If the information that's in the survey is not in a format that the tools on the other end can communicate with, it's going to pose some problems. Now, if you're thinking about using something like SurveyMonkey, chances are it's already going to be accessible. And so I think that's a really good approach to go because they've already built that capacity into their survey tool. If you're doing your own survey, it's much less likely to be built in, and your IT people are going to have to get involved because there is a handshaking that has to take effect there in order for this to work. And there are requirements on certain things, like if you mouse over something, there's supposed to be a a text box under certain circumstances that pops up with information about what you're mousing over, for example. I'm not an expert on that. I can't give you a more detailed answer to that, except to say that there is a handshaking that has to take place, and some of it does need to be on your end. Got one in the back?
I can add a little bit extra to that response, Marty. The W3C World Wide Web Consortium has guidelines that will, if you're going to be creating your own website survey, you can create that. They give you guidelines. It's designed for techies to go look at it. And yes, you are correct, Marty. The Survey Monkey has designed it about 98% accessible with speech access and other disabilities. So that's your simple way to go for it, but if you need to do something internal, you definitely need to look at the W3C.org website. Thank you.
Thank you. I knew that there was more to that answer.